So my name is Nancy Fulton, and this is an event on writer's block causes and cures, and it's actually going to touch on all forms of creative blocks. If you were a fine artist, your writer's block would manifest as not being able to do fine art, as opposed to somebody who's an actor who all of a sudden decides he can't get on the stage. You'll find it a very interesting call if you suffer from writer's block, or if you have to support or manage people who suffer from creative block, which if you're working in the entertainment industry will sooner or later be everyone. My guest today is Dr. Rebecca Roy, who's built a successful practice helping entertainment industry professionals reach their goals, manage their stress, and deal with the natural ebb and flow of creative careers. She's a licensed clinical psychologist with both a PhD and a master's degree in clinical psychology, and has 12 years' experience as a psychotherapist licensed to treat both individuals and couples. She uses evidence-based treatment approaches, which are both solution-focused and long-lasting, which help her patients reach their goals while remaining grounded, sane, and creative. She's a former coach of Olympic athletes and has 20 years of experience helping people reach their goals, including many writers. And she's been featured in the New York Times, LA Times, Reuters, CNN, and on many other major media. So with that, Dr. Roy, would you like to spend a few minutes talking about how you found yourself working with so many creative professionals?
Okay, thanks, and welcome to everybody. I'm really excited to work with you today, and I hope that I can be of service. How did I get to doing this? Well, it's kind of a long, twisted road, as most people find in creative work. I started out as an athlete, and I then became a writer, and then I was a director and actor, and then I worked with Olympic athletes. I came back and worked with the athletes in the sport I was in. And it was always a creative endeavor. It was always finding your way through something. It was finding the through line. It was finding the psychological underpinnings of things. And certainly as a director and an actor, you're always looking at what the psychology is under the character and what's driving that character, that scene, that show, whatever. So it was a pretty natural transition, actually, when I became a psychologist. I just love coaching people. I love helping people get to where they want to go. And I like to help them get there as quickly as possible with as least amount of drama and problems.
Can you talk about some of the causes of writer's block and other forms of creative inhibition that you've seen in the past with the clients that you've treated?
One cause of writer's block is there's something about the work itself that's bringing up a past issue that you didn't know was there or was hiding, or it's just the setting that you're in. Another cause can be depression or anxiety. A lot of people in the industry have bipolar disorder, so, they're great when they're on the manic high, but when they're in the depressive low, they have a much more difficult time. Then there's external factors, your life, what's going on in the room, what you're saying to yourself about your writing and about the block itself. How you speak to yourself about your own work and your own block is, to me, the defining factor, because you can get help for your depression, you can get help for your anxiety, but at the end of the day, you're still left with your own thought process and your own statements that you make to yourself.
Is it the case that the inhibitions come on gradually or as a general rule, or do they just sort of stop people cold in their tracks? I've known people who white-knuckle it on a regular basis. They sort of push themselves to the limit and treat themselves in a really kind of mean and brutal way while they're writing. And then all of a sudden, somewhere along the line, that stops being very functional for them.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I've had many writers that they'll wait to the very last minute because they have the belief that will motivate them, or the kind of negative self-talk that they're doing to themselves to kind of gin up a lot of energy or a lot of juice to write with. But over time, that method of working with your own psyche is very destructive because it's coming at it from a negative place, and it's not supportive of yourself. And so there are certainly people who can sustain that over the long haul, but you're much better off learning another way of motivating yourself, another way of creating emotional energy for your work than going from a negative perspective, because that's when you get into drugs and alcohol and acting out, and it just eventually will wear out.
It's kind of a mystical thing. They believe that it's the only way for them to work. If you're especially good at creating and you've been doing it a certain way a long period of time, you don't want to break the spell. Is that one of the things that you face when you talk to people about their creativity?
people don't know where creativity comes from. Everybody has their own process. But if you run into a block, it's just telling you you've got to look at a different way of entering your own psyche and maybe treat it differently, speak to it differently, and see if that makes a difference.
In the entertainment industry, it's almost a joke how many people see therapists. Everybody's got a therapist. But do you think it's the case that a lot of creative people don't turn to therapy until things have gotten pretty ugly, in terms of to the point that it's actively affecting their ability to get work?
Yes, and also they don't want the therapy to interfere with their creative process. That's usually the biggest fear, is that somehow if they get well or they get some different kind of influence, that their creative process will be less creative. I see that a lot with musicians. Writers seem to be a little bit more open because they have a different process. But yeah, usually they wait till it's really bad before they come in, because what you said is true. They're relying on how they've always worked, and they think they'll just keep pushing through, and somehow that same mechanism will come to the fore and give them what they need. That's when we have to do some sort of deeper dives within their own psyche and look at what exactly is it that you're writing about now, and how has your relationship to that theme or issue or character type changed?
Or how has your relationship with work changed,
Or your relationship with work changed, right.
Do you think that people working in television or people working in film, when they've had long runs of success, are sort of more impacted by the fact that there are these notions of 12-hour days? It's a very strange industry, the entertainment industry. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. Like, that's normal. And you wouldn't, even writers get impacted by that, the rewrites or the can you turn this draft around, in a couple of days or whatever. So do you think that those kinds of pressures make it so people burn out more quickly than they would, and more spectacularly than they might, being writers in different industries? Like, I don't really hear about tech writers, all of a sudden,
Well, yeah, I mean, you're asked to be creative for many, many hours a day, and the demands are very high, and you're still a human being with a psyche and a soul, and you can't just crank it out unless you're just a total hack. And it can be very destructive over time if you rely on a negative perspective with regards to that. It's very easy to get burned out.
Is it true to say that creative people really need to create in order to remain mentally healthy? I've seen a lot of people that I read their work, especially their first work coming up, and I'm thinking, you're literally, this is a great work because you're doing therapy to yourself in it. Like, and if you don't have it, I can see why your wheels would fall off, right? You need this to actually survive. So what happens to people who are really creative who can't create?
Oh, it's terrible. I mean, they're having depression and anxiety. It's very painful to watch, and I've seen people become suicidal. And the creative soul needs expression, and it needs to say something of importance. And so, having the vehicle to write it down is so powerful and so healing to the psyche when you can do that. But if you don't have the option of be able to be creative, and you're right, it can be devastating for people.
Is it the case that sometimes the stuff that's the most important to them is the stuff they can't write about?
Yes, that's the confluence of the internal factors and the block. That's when the block will come up, because you're telling yourself something about that material, whether it's I can't touch this, it's too much for me, or I'm really no good, why am I even trying to write this? Or one that I hear almost always is, they'll find out I'm a fraud and I can't write anything.
Or sometimes it'll be, if I tell the truth about this, then people will know the truth about this. When they're writing about things that have to do with abuse that they've committed or abuse they've had inflicted upon them, or when people are writing things that touch on things that they've actually experienced, then it can trigger this feeling that I don't want to tell the truth about this. I don't want to talk about where this work comes from because I don't want people to know.
Yes, completely naked.
Right.
And then you don't know what their judgment of that is.
In the documentation that you sent out, and for people that didn't get the documentation, you can send me an email at nancy.fulton@yahoo.com, and after the call, I'll make it available to you. You have artwork that actually talks about how schemas determine how we see the world. And I think in previous events I've talked about George Lakoff talking about frames, and that if you call something, if you say something is a death tax, that's different than calling it an inheritance tax, because just the use of the words reframes what the tax is about. So can you talk for a little bit about what schemas are and how they relate to creative blocks?
Schemas are basically an overall core belief that you have about yourself or the world, and it's how you view everything. It's like a prism through which you view things. So anything that happens, we filter it through our schema, our own schema. So the example I gave says, I'm stupid. So if that's someone's schema, then anything that happens, that's going to be your automatic understanding of the event. Oh, I did this wrong. It must be because I'm stupid. Well, it might be because you just didn't prepare well, or you had other things going on. If your belief is, I'm not good enough as a writer, I see that all the time, then anytime you reach a block, that's unconsciously in the background. You see, I'm not good enough. I can't do this. I shouldn't have done this. I should never have tried. And then, people tend to give up. Even though they're fighting the block, they're really fighting their own thought about their own work. I like this one on the bottom. Schemas are prejudices. They are like a shape with a cutout, and only pay attention to the other shapes which fit. So many writers get stuck in their own schema. And until you make that conscious, it's very hard to get out of that block, because it's unconscious at that point.
One of the worst experiences that I've watched people go through is, for some reason, they'll have gotten the idea when they were younger that they were lucky, and maybe to some degree they were lucky. But then all of a sudden they start hitting a point in time where work doesn't come as easy, or people aren't responding as favorably to their work, and they come up with the notion that they are unlucky. And that's just devastating. I mean, how do you fix luck, right?
It might have started as a certain kind of reality for you at one point, but then it gets applied in a broad brush. Did that answer that question? I'm not sure I answered that question.
I think you did. What you're saying is that, if you had the idea that you really understood, even though you're a man, you really understand how to write women, and you've always been everybody's always told you how great you are about writing about women. So originally there might have that blanket statement you inherited, and then one day when you start getting negative feedback on how well you write for women characters, it's like you feel like you've lost your mojo, and then you don't want to try to do anything, because you feel like you just can't. Nothing I do is right, because you are trying to apply this blanket. Your schema's been broken in that sense. All of a sudden you're not lucky anymore, or you can't write for women anymore, or you're not a wonderkind anymore, or whatever the thing is.
Yeah. Well, usually it's probably a simpler and deeper kind of thought in that kind of instance, which is almost always something like, I'm not good enough, lurking underneath. Because if you were able to write for women before and all of a sudden can't, but your belief has always been that you could write for women, you probably have a pretty strong belief in that. It's more that underneath there's some part of you that believes I'm really not good enough in general.
I'm an imposter. I should never have gotten this far. I just now got caught. That kind of thinking?
Yes, something like that. It's usually, deeper. Like they'll figure out that all those times that they told me I could write for women was really just a lie. I was really just hiding. I was really just a fraud. And now it's showing up. Now they're going to see it. That's a big one that comes up for blocks. And one that's very painful, even for the most successful writer. Because you always feel like you're not enough, because you're always striving.
Right. And I think that's kind of brings up the next topic, which is, is it the case that the fact that you've got this you've got a schema that influences this belief, influences your behavior, and then when you run into a period where you run into a creative block and you feel very uncomfortable and like a fraud or an imposter, does that not also influence your behavior? Sort of turning it into a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Yeah. I mean, you're kind of right about the fact that you feel crushed because what you believed to be true about yourself before is no longer true. And so that's when I go back and I look at what the material is actually, what you're working with at the time that's making you feel so uncomfortable. Because it's both the schema and the material itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So when you speak about the kind of material, so if somebody is writing a thing about international crime or politics or something like that, and they get handed this project, it's sort of in their wheelhouse or has been in the past, but for some reason they just can't write this piece. Is it the case that one of the things you do is talk to them about that piece and try to figure out what it is that makes this piece different from the other pieces they've had success with?
Yes, absolutely. I would ask, does it feel overwhelming? Is there something in the complexity? Is it that you feel tired of dealing with this particular kind of issue or these kinds of stories, or what in your past parallels this story? Is there a theme in the story that parallels? Is it betrayal or fear or whatever? Because stuff comes up for us from our past all the time, and we use it to write with. But then when you feel yourself stuck like that, there is something in that story, most likely, that there's a reason why you don't want to write it. It's painful on some level, and you just don't want to go into it.
Sometimes when you have to collaborate with other people and they have a vision for what this project is going to be about and what the characters are going to be about and how it's going to work, especially if I think you're the writer, they're calling upon you to write characters that with points of view that you may not agree, may not understand, or may not agree with. Honestly, like, I don't want to have any part of that character. I don't want to write that character, and yet my job requires me to do so. And I don't understand that character, so I can't write that character. So is it is it the case that you have to that you can help people dive into those kinds of characters so they do understand them well enough to write them, or how do you handle those kinds of things?
Yeah, it's a matter of developing empathy for the character that you dislike that much. And usually we dislike something a lot because it's either a part of ourselves or it's something we know and we don't want to deal with it. So we work on developing empathy for the character. What in your own life parallels that character, or who have you known that was similar to this character or this situation, and what are your feelings around that? Because that's what's coming up. You're just not aware of it. All you're having is a reaction like, I don't want to go there. I don't want to deal with this at all. And so we got to look at it a little deeper and sort of unpack it.
Is it the case that there are some kinds of work that literally make people feel sick to work on?
Well, I can give you kind of an example. There was someone I was working with, and he was very, very bright, had gone to an Ivy League school. And his biggest problem was that he would get stuck in his head all the time. He couldn't get between his head to his emotions. And he would get stuck in his scripts, but usually at the place where the character itself was stuck. So he was so embedded in his psyche that he couldn't go down into an emotional space for his own self in his own life. And when he entered into a script where a character couldn't get out of a situation, let's say, he would try to have the character think the way out instead of feel the character's way out, because that's opposite of his own way of operating in the world. And we worked really hard on helping him with that because it got him stuck every time. He would try to think his way out of things, and it was the same thing that was happening in his own life. He was stuck in his own head, and he wasn't able to make decisions, and he wasn't able to feel things. And it was showing up in the work as blocked characters.
Mm-hmm.
And I pointed out to him that, like, this character is you. You're just having them do what you do, which is intellectualize things instead of emotionally deal with them. And once we started to get that place where let's go to the emotional space, it was very hard for him because it was naked, it was uncomfortable, and he'd always relied on his mind. But he kept writing scripts that were quite intellectualized and didn't emotionally grab people. So there were several things happening there, right? You know, the character situation, how he approached it as a writer, but also his own relationship to himself within the world and how he works with his own life choices and everything else. It all kind of came together in this particular script, and he was just locked in. And so I had to really go after him for the head space part of it.
So it's interesting. Is it common that people who work with you end up developing new skills as writers or new skills as creative professionals because they're being forced to think creatively? You're calling upon them to actually think in a different way than they have been before about their work and about the themselves and how they create. I mean, is it evolutionary for them?
Yeah, it's all about. It's not just the work. The work is a symptom. Mm-hmm. It's really about you. It's about where you are and how you intersect with that work. So a lot of times people become quite different in terms of their writing and in terms of how they see themselves and their relationships and stuff like that, because it can't help but come out in the writing. Like for this particular person, he was stuck in every area of his life, unable to move forward, and so of course it showed up in the script. And so it was very satisfying to work with him because he was so smart and he was also very open. And but that's what I mean, like, you know, we get in our own way because it's a shadow piece of ourselves that we aren't interacting with, and it helps to have that outside eyes to point out and say, you know, you just are in your head in your life. That's why it's showing up in the script.
Right. You're not going to let your character do something you wouldn't do, and
because we have our ways of dealing with things. What we know. Yeah.
So solving the writer's block can also let go a lot of other problems, help release a lot of other roadblocks, because they're all symptomatic of the same kinds of thinking then.
Yeah, it's all part of the soup. It's all part of the stew. And it's a very complex one to figure out sometimes. You know, you're writing a scene about relationships or a relationship. You got to look at what is your understanding of a relationship and what are your feelings about that, and how are you allowing that to drive the scene or not drive the scene. And is there another way to look at it outside of your own perspective and your own schema? You'll have a schema about that too. Relationships are hard, or relationships are easy, or relationships are like my horrible marriage, or whatever it is, you know?
Right. Or relationships are black and white. And so, and I often think that the best screenplays are things that actually embed what amounts to education in them. You know, the notion. I think everybody that watched the movie Juno, the girl got pregnant, and the way her parents handled the pregnancy, and the way she, at 16, the way that she found a new set of parents for her child because she couldn't provide a good home for them. The solution, the thinking that the character went through and that her family went through and that we all went through in following them is what made the piece exceptional. So it makes sense to me that when you help a writer think outside the box, outside their box, you allow them to bring new insights into the characters, which makes the characters more interesting and the characters more important to people that happen to be watching the film.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a process between the writer and myself. We come up with all kinds of different things because we're working together and brainstorming, but I'm throwing in a lot of, understanding of that person's psychology that they're not aware of, and we then use that as a jumping off point to kind of see where we can, like I said with the guy who was stuck in his head, where can we open this up? Somebody else would have a completely different reaction.
One of the things when we were setting up to do this particular event, we talked about the fact that a lot of writers that were in the situation try very hard to help themselves. So they read books and they look at self-help solutions, and some of them make the situation significantly worse. Can you talk sort of a little bit about why some of the things that you've seen and why those solutions can be so dysfunctional?
Well, I think the books, self-help books, are great and can be really helpful for some things. But the problem is, if you're in a block and you feel that bad, and you pick up a book that says, just do this, just do that, just do this, just write a few hours a day, you'll be, it's like a simplicity that, or a simple approach to something that's really much more complex than that. And you can feel worse because it's sort of like saying, oh, you want to lose 20 pounds? Well, just go out and run, you'll be fine. Because there's much more to what's going on with that block, most likely. And so, unfortunately, people can often feel much worse because they feel like, well, I bought this book and I did everything that they said and I still can't write, so that means that I'll never work again, or I've lost it, or whatever. And those are the kinds of messages that you want to stay away from, because those books are written for many people, but they're not written for your particular psychology.
One of the things you mentioned is the fact that there are a lot of people in Hollywood who are very successful, who are working with bipolar disorder, who are borderline, who have narcissistic personality disorder, or a lot of narcissistic personality traits. Is it the case, you think, that when people have a serious problem, in particular, that sometimes the fact that they're trying to treat themselves, it's a little bit like them trying to treat themselves for cancer. Like, you don't just, it turns out, sir, you're an extremely good writer and you're very creative, and you're also, as it turns out, manic depressive. So it's really the fact that you cannot at this exact moment choose to work for 15 days straight without sleeping on the screenplay and just get it out the door. It may be the case that there's an underlying reason for that, which goes beyond simple writing.
Absolutely. It's pretty well known that a lot of creative people have bipolar disorder. And one of the reasons a lot of people in the industry have bipolar disorder is because sometimes when you're manic, you can write a lot, and it's great. And you can have all kinds of creative ideas that come in. So you're not working in a bank. You're working on a script, and you have to have the ability to access your creativity. So bipolar disorder is actually pretty helpful for that sometimes. You need to know how to work with that disorder so that you can get the most out of, not your manic highs, but you can maintain your stability and still be creative. But yeah, it's a really common disorder in the industry. And matter of fact, Kay Redfield Jamison's book, Touched by Fire, is really great for that. Talks all about writers and creative people who have bipolar disorder, and goes into it much better than I can ever hope to. But that's a good one to read.
Do you help people in the entertainment industry who are working in high-pressure professional environments? Like, I think...
Yeah.
I've done a series of events talking. I've done a couple of events talking about narcissistic personality disorder, because I do. I've worked in the entertainment industry enough to run into a few people that.
Yeah.
They're very. It's shockingly. The thing is that people with NPD in the entertainment industry are very charismatic, and they do get stuff done because they just do, and so you end up working with these people. And you don't realize until you're behind the wall how things are going to go for you. So is that something you help people with as well, in terms of trying to stay creative while dealing with crazy people?
Oh yeah, navigating the crazy is a daily, if not hourly, activity in my office. It's a narcissistic industry. It's an industry that rewards narcissism. So you better know how to deal with that because they're going to be there. So yeah, I deal with it all the time.
Can you talk a little bit
And
about specifically what narcissism looks like and how it's different than just being kind of a braggart or just being like how does it manifest for the lives and the people around somebody who's got that kind of personality disorder or personality type?
well, those people with narcissistic personality disorder believe in control. Everything is black and white to them. They are special, and only special people can be around them. There's usually it's a very unpleasant experience generally, unless you can convince the narcissist that you're at their level. Then you have a chance.
Are they
Um,
easy to reason with? Like, are they like, in other words, let's say that you're working for a director who's narcissistic, or you're working with an actor who's narcissistic, and as a collaborator, because the screenwriter ends up the screenwriters work, after they finish
right.
the screenplay, they're still involved in making snips and changes and adjustments.
Mhm.
So, based
Well, it's
upon the
always
people that come in,
right. It's always about a fragile ego, right? So that's
Mhm.
what drives narcissistic personality disorder is someone who's actually very frightened and doesn't feel good about themselves at all. And so if you know that everything they're doing is really bluster and cover, and you can kind of see the person underneath it for the scared person that they are
Mhm.
actually, without letting them know that you know that,
Mhm.
sometimes that kind of empathy can help with them.
Mhm.
Of course, it's hard to say because there are as many narcissists as there are people in the world. I mean, I don't know. Everybody has their own version of it, and it's on a continuum. Some people are horrendous, and others are just a little bit. But it's an industry full of narcissists because you're wanting to do something that very few people get to do, and
Mhm.
you're putting your whole person out to do it, and you're greatly rewarded if you can. And
Exactly. Exactly. And
yeah,
I also think that you sort of have to you have to be unafraid of the things that other people are afraid of, and
absolutely.
the
And
business
believe that you're entitled to do that
right, and that other
because you're
people
so special.
right. Well, and also the vindictiveness can get a little bit with some narcissists you make them mad, all of a sudden they don't just go after you, they don't just fire you, it's like you could have worked with them for 20 years, but you
Yeah,
make them mad, and then all of a sudden they just blackball you, so you can't work anywhere, and that's taking care of that for them because they never want to see you again because you make them feel bad. It's
right.
like, wait.
You've narcissistically wounded them.
Right.
You've hurt their ego somehow, and that you're going to pay the price for that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned borderline at one point. Can you talk just briefly, just a
Mhm.
few seconds, about what a borderline personality is?
Borderline and narcissists are pretty closely aligned. It's terrible that they call most in the DSM-5 and
Mhm.
often in material they generally call women borderlines and
Mhm.
men narcissists. I
Mhm.
don't know that I buy that, but certainly there is a complexity with the borderline personality disorder. Where vindictiveness can very much come into it. If they feel they're going to be abandoned, then it can get very ugly. There's a complexity of relationships. Things are black and white. Someone is all good or all bad. There's emotional drama. It's very intense. I think narcissists, very same thing. They can be vindictive as well. It's probably just not quite the same complexity of emotion. It's
Mhm.
more, I'm entitled to do this, and so I will.
Mhm.
Um, whereas borderlines, there's a little more emotional um, complexity, for lack of a better word, at the moment, off the top of my head here.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, but both of those disorders are very common. And borderlines and narcissists can both be very, very charming people and very bright people. And then there are sneaky borderlines that don't look borderline at first. They seem like the nicest person in the world, and then it comes out, usually under stress, or if you're going to abandon them, or they feel they're being abandoned. With narcissists, if they feel their ego is being challenged at all, that fragile underlying ego is being wounded at all, you'll get that's when the claws will come out.
So is it ever the case that a writer or a creative professional acquires a creative block because they've had to work with some of these people and they've ended up running into trauma because there was just no way to win?
Oh yeah, and that's another problem with certain personality disorders is they make it so you can't win. And yeah, you have to kind of be able to step back and know when it's them and when it's you. And sometimes you're stuck in a situation where that's who you have to work with. So you got to kind of figure a way around their psychology, just for self-preservation.
When people are trapped with those people and they don't understand that there are those kinds of personalities in the world, or they're not an expert because they haven't, had 10 years of training learning how to deal with these people, is it the case that when they come to see you, you can recognize the symptoms of trauma or a reaction to trauma from something that they've encountered in the workplace?
Oh, absolutely. And also, a lot of times when you're working with a narcissist or a borderline, what you'll get is a lot of projection from that person. So you'll feel inadequate. You'll feel less than all of a sudden when you didn't before. You'll feel you can get headaches and nausea. It's all part of like interacting with someone who's quite toxic, and they like to project. So that part of themselves that they can't tolerate you will feel it, and you'll feel like there's something wrong with you all of a sudden. That can even often be a problem with writer's block, is all of a sudden you can't write and you think it's you. Well, it might also just be that you're around someone who's projecting very heavily. And again, that's an unconscious process, and we're not always aware of it.
When you're counseling somebody and they come into you and they talk about writer's block and you start working with them, you have the opportunity to actually talk about their work environment, sort of get familiar. So it's not just the script that you focus on. You sort of take a wider picture so that you can actually figure out if they're in a toxic work environment, or if they've always had these big, speed bursts, and then they've had periods of depression. So as a psychologist, you're taking care of the whole person and on a broader perspective than simply focusing on the kind of self-help solutions they have in books. You're not just going to someone's not going to come to you and just say, well, I'm having trouble writing. Well, you need to write 10 minutes more a day, or maybe if, take a vacation or whatever. Yeah.
No, I try to take a really holistic viewpoint, because your psyche and your soul is what you use to create. So everything that's around you that impacts you is part of the block. So I'm going to look at your history and what, like I said before, how that's intersecting with the material, who's around you. If you're in a toxic environment, that can be part of the block. That could be a big part of it. Are you being traumatized by that? If so, does it mirror something earlier in your life where you had somebody projecting onto you and you weren't aware of it? That can happen too, because it's all very unconscious, these projections. And, sometimes we're around someone and we just go, I feel bad around this person. I don't know why, but they make me feel terrible, even though they're not doing anything that outwardly would seem like it. It must be me. Well, yeah, we look at it very holistically, and that is why being able to work with someone individually versus just reading out of a book is helpful, because we can bring in all those different factors and sort of, I use a whiteboard, so I put everything on the whiteboard and we sort of go through it all and almost like diagram it out like a football play.
Do you think that most people really kind of don't believe that they have an unconscious mind, or that their unconscious mind takes actions without their awareness? Because I find that's something that people don't believe. They think when they go to sleep they have dreams, and that's unconscious. But when they're waking up and they're in their day-to-day life, the idea that maybe today that they didn't go to the gym, or that tomorrow they ate healthy. They'll eat healthy, but the day after that, on Wednesday they won't. That they don't understand that all of these little micro decisions actually do have, that there is an unconscious mind, and it actually is working all of the time.
Oh yeah. Yeah, most people don't know that. I mean, when they come to therapy and we try to make the unconscious conscious in order to restructure things or what have you, they are often really shocked. And so I will have people write things down. That's why part of the documentation I gave you, there's a schema activation formulation. You guys can do that on your own, but that's an exercise that will help you to make your unconscious conscious. But I think it's a really good point, because most people aren't aware of their unconscious. Even I have to work on it a lot of times. Like, wow, what did I do that for? What's going on? I have to, we don't grow up learning to talk to ourselves and ask ourselves what's happening here. We just kind of go about our day or make the choices we make, and then we turn around and go, well, what happened there? I think it was Jung that said the unconscious always shows up as fate.
I think it's particularly important for writers, actors that are just coming in, new directors, because one of the things I see that happening, and it is, to me, very apparently unconscious action, like self-sabotage, just constant self-sabotage. If you're turning in a screenplay or you're passing around a screenplay, and it's not professionally edited. I mean, it doesn't really cost that much to go just send the screenplay to somebody and have them go through and correct all the spelling mistakes. It's not expensive. It doesn't cost a lot of money. It doesn't take a lot of time, and it's kind of the easiest checkbox to check. And yet people won't. And it's like that self-sabotage. Why would you not do that? You're spending a lot more money, a lot more time doing things that are far more expensive. And people have 100 kinds of self-sabotage that they do, and they don't realize that there are these unconscious ideas that they're just making manifest over and over and over again. Do you think they need to have professional help, or will it accelerate how quickly they get on with the work that they came here to do?
I think it'll help a lot. It's not for everybody. You have to tolerate, wading through your own stuff and looking at it and working with it. And, for some people that's very frustrating. But I think having that outside perspective to help you is always a good thing. But in terms of self-sabotage, I see that a lot. And usually when I see it, it's because there is some kind of underlying schema, which is something along the lines of, I'm not good enough. Well, let me make sure that I'm not good enough by turning in a draft that's not even edited. You know what I'm saying? You've reaffirmed your own bias, but that's unconscious to you. So you act out in a way that's sabotaging. So it is essential to look at that,
Or the world's not fair. Like people, the world's not a fair place, so it doesn't really matter what I do. Or another one of my favorites is, the sort of the starving artist thing, like the underlying idea that people have to sacrifice for their art. You're not a real artist if you're not sacrificing.
Right. Yeah, I try to disavow people that notion real fast because it's not going to be helpful very long.
Well, especially because
it's kind of just an idea. It's just like a mythic idea.
But they don't realize that they're putting it into practice. That it's not just something that they're thinking in the back of their minds. It's not just something they think once in a while. It's something that they actually every single day they create that reality around them all the time. This thing that I have a friend who says, and I think it's a very common saying, thoughts become things. And it is true. The kinds of thinking that you're doing, and confused thinking translates into a really awful world, because you're constant. I guess we can see it. People who are extremely racist, they project that that loathing onto the world, and their whole life becomes.
Get it back.
Right. It just goes on and on and on, and it's like exactly. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that continues to eat them. It just makes it so they can never think about anything else except this thing that they don't, that they hate. Do you see people when they come to you for writer's block or for creative blocks? Do you find that you make progress? Do they feel like they make progress swiftly as a rule? Like they struggle with something for years, and then they work with you for a few weeks, and they start to see light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, I'd like to say that I'm just an amazing miracle worker, but
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, I do have a history of working with Olympic athletes, and so that's my perspective: is how are we going to get you to play it to win instead of playing it not to lose? That's
Mm-hmm.
always my perspective in the room, and so I don't like to spend time on what isn't working. I want to get you forward on what will work. So I've had some really good success with people, and it's always a fit. So, I'm quite straightforward. I don't mince words. I get right in it. And that has to be something that works for people. But most of the time, they make good progress within the first 6 weeks or so, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And is it the case that if it's not working out well for them, if you're not seeing them move forward, do you provide them with referrals to other people that they think might be a better fit?
Oh yeah. Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And then
I'm not here to take the money. I'm here to help you. And if I can't help you, then I'm not gonna, keep it stringing it along.
And if you run into people who have things like bipolar disease, or they have diseases that look like mental illness, I mean, I can't imagine.
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine that you don't run into people who are have been working for a long time in the industry and they're starting to see signs of mental illness related to growing older. Because that's all I think for a lot of writers, that's our worst fear, is the idea that when I'm 60 or I'm 65 or I'm 70, I'll start showing signs of how will I work then? And so
yeah, all that stuff gets talked about, and it's therapy, but it's also working through the block. So I had a really interesting woman client who wasn't able to write for years and years, and she believed that she was just so blocked that she couldn't write. And I said, well, you're not blocked, you're depressed. There's a big difference. Mm-hmm. And so we had to work on her depression and lifting that depression before she could really even start to write again. And she went on and did really well and wrote 4 scripts right away, right after that.
Really?
Because we rephrased. I helped her understand that she had a clinical depression, and that was impacting her ability to write. And it wasn't because she couldn't write; it was because she just was depressed. So we had to work on that. And once we got it going, and we looked at the underlying reasons for the depression, and we got that moving, she did much much better. And she had 4 scripts right away.
So it really is a holistic. Taking a holistic approach actually solves the problem more quickly, because you're not just you're not deciding what the illness is and then treating it. You're diagnosing the illness and then treating it.
Yeah, I mean, it is a complex thing. Like I said, many things could be underneath that block. And so with somebody who has experience, education, and training, it really helps. Just picking up a book's not going to tell you, hey, actually you have bipolar disorder, and right now you're in a bipolar depression, which is heavier than a regular depression. That's why you can't write. That's part of it.
Do you think it makes a difference that you work with creative professionals, that you've really concentrated your practice specifically on working with creative professionals instead of being a counselor who is not so specialized? I mean, there's a lot of marriage and family therapists, and I suspect many of them may be able to provide treatment for depression and so forth. But the fact that you specifically work with creative professionals who are writers or who are working in the entertainment industry and who have to be creative every single day, do you think that the specialization is important to being able to provide solutions more quickly?
I think so, because you have to understand the world. This is a world unlike any other. I mean, you're not working in a bank. You're not working. There are factors, and there is a world that is absolutely part of the work. And if you don't understand it, then you're going to miss a lot of nuances. And also, just I have the creative background. I've done it all my life, and so I think it is very important. And also, I went back and got my PhD and did a lot of work with Jungian studies, which looks at things in a very different way. And I think that's helped a lot.
I think so too. I think that there's a reason why a lot of creative professionals are very drawn to Jung. it relies upon the unconscious. It relies upon valuing the unconscious mind and seeing that as a source of stories and characters. If you think about Harper Lee and you think about Atticus Finch, I think there's a lot of people in the world who feel like Atticus Finch is as real as any person they've ever heard about on TV but never met. And I think the same is true for Big Brother. How many times have you heard people in a political conversation talking about Big Brother, which was which came from a book, right?
Right. All of those concepts from classic mythology, Jung worked with all of the hero's journey. That's Joseph Campbell. That came from Jung. There's a lot of things about transformation and levels of soul, for lack of a better word. But being able to interact with your own unconscious is very Jungian and really helpful for writers. And I always say, try to read. It's hard to read Jung because he's hard to understand. I went through a whole PhD program. I'm still a little confused, but there are some things that I got out. I can figure out. But
well, I also think I think a thing that is important to recognize about Jung is that he worked for many, many, many years, and I'm not entirely sure English was his first language. So
no, it wasn't. That's true.
And so I too have read Jung and gone, what? And also his sentences.
No, it's way out. Yeah.
His sentences
don't
always
wrap your head around it.
Yeah, his sentences seem to have sometimes multiple subjects. Like what did we just talk about? But it's but I do think it's interesting that we are always that writers are drawn to him. They will read him, and I think it has to do with the fact that we know there's a sense that there's something metaphysical about the process of writing. It's something that's otherworldly about it.
Absolutely. And things like the collective unconscious, we all have similar and why he was so drawn to myth is because there are those themes that run throughout cultures that we as human beings always are drawn to and form the great basis of stories and understanding of ourselves and the world. And that's all part of his work, of what he brought to psychology. And so I think, having embedded myself in that kind of training really does help with working with writers and looking at it maybe from a very almost mystical perspective at sometimes when it's necessary. I'll apply CBT, like this schema stuff. That's all CBT. But it's making use of CBT with an underpinning that's not simple. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's perfect. That's a perfect description. One of the people listening on the call says something I'm sure that you help people with, which is my problem is not the writing, it's getting the writing into the right hands. I've been paralyzed regarding this step. For example, finding and getting an agent. My scripts just sit there gathering dust. So is that the kind of thing you help people with as well? The fear of diving into the process of entering the industry professionally?
Yeah, I would do that. I would look at that the same way as we've been talking about the scripts themselves. I would say, if you've gotten it out there and you can't get anywhere, are you giving up? Are you telling yourself you'll never make it? What's the point? Or do you get up and say, I'm going to try another day. I'm going to try another way. I'm going to do something else with this. Because of course, rejection over time, it's very, very debilitating. That you have to work with what you're telling yourself about it. That's your control in the situation, because you can't control their response. You can only control your response to that situation.
Right. Yeah. And also, if you're kind of counting yourself out by not sending the stuff out to go to an agent, then you're deciding it's not good enough. Nobody else has even had the chance to say it's not good enough.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
And there's a lot of people in the world, so you'd have to take at least 50% of them would have to say it was not good enough before you could even take that as an authoritative opinion.
Right. Right.
So somebody else asks something related, which is how do you deal with criticism of your writing? Even though some people say they like it, if a lot of people are saying that they don't like your work, can you handle the discouragement or the lack of belief in your own abilities?
Yeah, because it speaks to a bunch of different things.
Mhm.
First of all, you've done work, and you're getting feedback that people don't like it and some people do like it. So what do you believe about that? Do you take the people who don't like it and say, well, what is it that you don't like about it, and see if there's something you can concretely do? Or do you just take that as gospel and fold?
Mhm.
If you have to say, where's my control in this situation? I can't write from a place of somebody else thinks this about my writing. You'll always be blocked. It'll always be frustrating. And there's always going to be someone who doesn't like what you write. It's just reality.
You really have to find a way to determine how you're going to assess the feedback that you get to determine what you're going to implement in your work and what you're going to choose not to implement in your work.
Yeah. Yeah, and how much you're going to let other people's opinions stop you. And that's your own decision.
So somebody else asked two questions, which I think are interesting, which is, she says, I'm obsessed by grammar and correcting grammar and punctuation marks, even in text. I also email basically anything I write, even though it takes extra time. Is that strange or odd? And
no, I think it sounds like you want to be. Is there more to that question?
I think she might be saying it feels to her somewhat OCD-ish, right? The fact that she's like, how many times am I going to check the door to make sure that the door is locked? Right. How many times am I going to check this email for grammar, or obsess over, if I'm just sending it, something to a person that I know, and I've checked it over once for mistakes because I want to represent myself well, but now I'm afraid to let it go because what if there's a mistake I haven't seen yet? So every email takes 15 times as long to send because I'm afraid of making that mistake.
You're telling yourself something that, like, along the lines of, if I'm not perfect, I can't send anything out. It has to be perfect.
Right.
And if it's not perfect, I've failed, or there's some kind of something you're telling yourself about that. And that's what's stopping you, is the idea that unless it's perfect, you're not good enough.
If nobody's complained about an email that's gone out to them, and you've never seen it have any impact on them, whether or not this phrasing or that phrasing was better, then it's different with a screenplay because it's representing you all over the place, and because people, so obsessing about the grammar and making sure that it's letter perfect is a different situation, because that is a work that's supposed to be entirely finished. It's a different thing when it's an email you're just sending out to people. And if you're sending it to agents or managers, maybe so. But if you're emailing somebody that you've worked with 22,000 times before, and you can't let it go without 30 minutes of analysis to make
Right.
It's like, how obsessed are you?
Yeah, you want to. It is obsessive, but it's obsessive because you've got some thought process going on there that says it must be absolutely perfect, or else this person will think badly of me, or I won't make it, or the world will fall apart. Whatever it is that you've got going on in terms of that particular thought.
Well, and not to mention the fact that if it is the case that it has to be letter perfect, then it's not a question. It's not something that calls for anxiety. It's something that calls for a solution. Find the solution that makes it so you can feel confident that it's gone out letter perfect, so you don't have to think about this anymore.
Right. That's how you know it's not about that.
Right, exactly.
Or you would find a solution to it. You'd get somebody else to read it and double check it, and you know.
Yeah.
So that's not,
It's the anxiety part. If there's anxiety about it, that starts to be a little on the creepy side. Grammar should not cause anxiety.
Yeah. But, it does. It does.
I know it does, but it shouldn't, though. Okay, I'm a songwriter and musical performer, and my producer, co-writer, bandmate was my husband of 10 years who left me 9 months ago. He's very talented and more successful and advanced than I am as a musician, and I'm very triggered by my apartment because he left me there, and by the fact that he was such a big part of my creative process, even though I had a solo career before him. How can I change my attitude about my creative process without him and in my apartment? Before I met him, I had a lot more confidence, but now I'm having trouble making myself sit down and write in my apartment and also performing on my own. I have a lot of feelings of not being good enough without him, but I'm suffering not so much not being able to write, produce music, and perform on my own. I know I'm grieving and I've gotten some therapy about it, but I want to get back into the world in the meantime because I think it will help me heal and feel more confident. My songwriting has always been something that I trusted until now. And the second question, which is related, you mentioned that many people are mean and brutal during their process, and Dr. Roy says to learn more healthy ways to motivate themselves. What are more healthy ways to create? And where does creativity come from? What a great set of questions.
Great questions. Awesome. Yeah. How do you talk to yourself about your songwriting? Do you write a little bit and then say, well, that's horrible, and just stop? That's being brutal to yourself. You have to learn new ways of speaking to yourself. I like that piece. That felt good to me. It may not be perfect yet, but I feel like there's something there. Let me keep going. Those kinds of words that you need to say to yourself as you're creating. I think you're probably as you said, you're in a grieving process. And a lot of times it can feel like things have just shut down. But the greatest gold is in the greatest pain. And if you can let yourself access it, and I'm sure you can because you're a musician, and musicians are great at this, and really go there. There might be a piece of it you just don't want to experience yet. I think if you allow yourself to experience that pain, it will unlock whatever's stopping you. Without knowing your whole history, it's hard for me to say that. You're working with somebody, and I'm glad you're working through the grief. But the fact that you're in the apartment with him, that you shared with him, is very significant. You know, all the memories are there, all the feelings are there. Energetically, he's probably still there. And, you know, you may not have let go of him yet. And until you do, you got to say, let me look at the relationship differently. Let me see if there's another way into my work, and think about the work and the relationship a new way. Again, without having you in front of me, I couldn't, kind of work that through. But try to forgive yourself for whatever happened in that relationship, and try to forgive yourself right now, and gently help yourself move forward.
She sent a follow-up question saying that she's considering trying to work with him again, and asking if that would be, generally speaking, unhealthy.
It's hard to say generally speaking, because I don't know the nature of your relationship or why you broke up. As just a creative energy, if you worked well together and you really want to work together just for that, I don't see a big problem. But if you're doing it on some unconscious level because you want to be near him or you want to get back together with him, then you're kind of muddying the waters. That's why I'm thinking maybe there's a piece you just don't want to let go yet. Because to find your own voice as your own songwriter, you kind of need to let that go.
So someone else asks that says that she's a screenwriter, and her blocks are mostly in the endings. And is that something you've seen before, where people have trouble actually finding the ending of pieces? She says, I've started many projects in many different genres, but never finished since I left school. And none of the therapists that I've tried to work with have been able to answer this question.
Well, okay, so what I would do is I would look at endings in your own life. Were there people that left you that you didn't want to leave and it was unresolved? I know that sounds kind of corny, but that's kind of the way I would work with you. I would explore the nature of endings in your life. Why do you want to leave things undone all the time? Is it because you're avoiding pain? Is it because you don't want to let go of something that gives you purpose? There's a million different possibilities to that answer. A lot of different answers to that question, but around the issue and the theme of endings in your life, that's what you need to look at.
Are there any other topics that we didn't address that we should have talked about today? Sort of run through the questions that we had, but
I can't think of any. Like I said, it's a complicated matter, and a block does not mean that you're not a creative person or that you don't have it anymore, or that there's something wrong with you. There are a lot of layers to it. You got to kind of find your way through it with someone who knows what they're doing before you give yourself the message that you can't write. or you're not good enough.
And isn't it part of the decision deciding, part of the process of reaching out to a therapist, one of the valuable steps is saying, I am worth it. I mean, that's the first indication you give to yourself that my work is worth it, that I'm worth it. That solving this problem is,
I'm going to fight for it. Yeah. I'm gonna play it to win. I'm not going to sit here and play it not to lose.
Right, and also the fact, and I think the other thing we talked about today, what was interesting, is when you said that working through a writer's block can also transition, and frequently does transition, into removing blocks across out of the rest of your life. The thinking that's giving you the writer's block is probably the same thinking that's blocking you on a number of fronts. Like the guy you talked about that had intellectualized everything, turned everything into, and we all know people that intellectualize everything. It's not about how people feel. It's about doing the rational thing and doing the right thing. And it's like, yeah, I understand the rational thing and the right thing. It doesn't feel right, and I don't want to do it. That's sort of
right. Exactly.
So the fact that him learning how to solve that problem for his screenplay pulled the pins out on the rest of his life as well, so that he could move forward on those fronts as well. So
right.
Which I think, isn't it funny how creative people, they might be facing divorce, they might be, there's a million things that might be happening to them that are all really torturous. They might have a horrible relationship with their mother or father, or children or whatever. But the thing that they'll go save, the reason that they'll go into therapy is because they want to be able to write.
Right. Right. I know. Sometimes I say it right away, and they sort of look at me, sort of tweaks, like, "How did you figure that out?" Well, kind of fair.
Let me guess. You
write who you are and what you are.
So you're having trouble writing romantic relationships. How are they working out in real life too?
Right. It sounds super obvious, but when you're in the middle of it, you just don't see it.
So the script about your father is really difficult. The script about a man confronting the death of his father, difficult.
Mm-hmm.
How did you handle that?
Right.
Yes.
Exactly.
Creative people are a trip. So what I'd like to do is, if you could, can people reach out to you if they want to talk about working with you going forward?
I'd love to hear from people. So my website is theindustrytherapist.com, and you can contact me through there. And I'm more than happy to talk to people, and I'm open to working with the group. If the group needs my help or anything like that. I love getting people to where they want to go. There are scripts out there that exist because we work them through, and I'm very proud of that. So if I can help in any way, I'm happy to do so.
Well, it's been an honor to talk with you. And what I'm going to do is take this audio recording, and I'll edit it up, and I'll make it available to you to listen to. And then if you say it's okay, I'll make it available to the people who couldn't join us on the call today, or to people who were on the call who'd like to be able to listen to it again. And then I'll also make it available so you can give it to people as well if you're inclined.
Okay, great. Well, this has been awesome. Thank you so much.
You're a wonderful person. I can't tell you. I'm just really, really, really proud to have had an opportunity to interview you. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
You too. Enjoy the rain.
Okay, I will.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.